On Sunday, June 30th, 1912, a cyclone, actually a tornado, an F4 tornado, hit the city of Regina and devastated it. This is the story of the deadliest tornado in Canadian history that killed 28 people, injured 300, and left 2,500 homeless. Let's go.
This is bad news.
My God.
Falling out right now.
Anything could happen.
Wow.
I'll watch the video later.
Feel the heat.
I need more blankets, I need water.
Ain't dry mopping this.
The tornado formed 18 kilometers south of the city and continued for another 12 kilometers past it before dissipating. It was approximately 490 feet wide at its base. The winds have been estimated at 400 kilometers per hour, making it the equivalent of a high-end F4 on the Fujita scale. It also displayed multiple vortex structure throughout the city's residential areas, leaving individual houses untouched next to homes that were completely flattened. The worst damage was in the residential area north of Wascana Lake and the central business district. Many businesses, both brick and wood, were entirely destroyed. The Central City Library building was opened in just May 11th of that same year. 6 weeks later, though, it was among the many buildings that suffered tremendous damage. In just 20 minutes, it completely leveled a number of houses and caused many others to explode. The affluential residential area to the south was substantially diminished, but the tornado left houses untouched here and there, immediately adjacent to houses which were flattened. In the warehouse district, it destroyed many of the storage buildings. The CPR roundhouse was stripped to the rafters, and boxcars were pulled from the tracks and hurtled through the air. The tornado claimed 28 lives and rendered 2,500 homeless. It took the city 2 years to repair the damage and 10 years to pay off the storm debt. Here's some incredible stories I heard and found on CBC radio archives. These were from 50 years after the cyclone.
So they didn't know what the heck this was.
They were swimming in Wascana Lake. They were having fun. They were enjoying themselves. And this is just, there was the legislature. It hit the legislature first, and then it hit the lake, and then everybody there, and then went right on into the city
through LORNE,
Victoria Park, and then hit the business district and the railway district and everything. 28 were killed and 13 died afterwards from injuries, and so it's claimed, you see, and 200 were seriously wounded, 2,500 left without homes.
An article was put up on CanadianHistory.ca called Regina's Day of Wrath, the Killer Cyclone of 1912. It was written by John E. Stewartson and posted there back in 2016. It tells about not just the damage, but some of the crazy stories that happened that day. On Smith Street, houses to the west side were unaffected to the extent that potted plants on open verandas were not even blown over. The houses on the east side of the street were reduced to rubble. Lillian Vo McKinnon, in an unpublished memoir, notes that the first indication for half the city, cyclone cut a narrow path, was to see cars and fire trucks with the wounded making for the hospitals. As it passed the legislative buildings, which were only lightly damaged, the cyclone sucked out all the examination papers for all of Saskatchewan's grade school for the entire year. Throughout the province, teachers had to pass or fail their pupils on the basis of their recollection of how well they had done during the year.
Now, when you see those pictures, see the buildings down, you'd think that there would have been, 400 killed. But the miracles, some of the miracle stories are really incredible.
Do you know some?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, Bruce Langton was in a canoe. Bruce Langton was in a canoe. And he had a pal with him, and the pal's name was Philip Steele. And Philip Steele was whirled through the air and smashed down on the ground, and that was the end of poor old Philip Steele. But Bruce Langton was in the canoe, and he was carried through the air in the canoe, and he was deposited in the park, Wascana Park, and he still had the paddle in his hand, and he wasn't hurt. Now, what happens is this. What happens with this? Is this in a tornado? I said that a tornado, sometimes the air is going up. Mm-hmm. There's an updraft, and sometimes there's a downdraft. So Bruce was lucky. What happened was that he got caught, so they got carried through the air, and when he reached the park, there must have been a kind of updraft, so that the updraft was strong, but not strong enough to overcome gravity. So gravity just gently put him down on the ground, and the updraft sort of kept him floating there, so he landed with the paddle. We must wonder what the hell had happened.
His companion had been killed.
As it swept across Wascana Lake, heading to the center of the city, the cyclone created a gigantic water spout. The boathouse club by the lake was demolished. All those who sought shelter inside it were severely injured. One was killed there.
Yeah.
Now, like that.
Leonard Marsh, on the other hand, the story went all over the place, and people believed it for years. it was believed that he had gone in a canoe from Wascana Lake to Victoria Park, which is a distance of almost a mile, because he'd been found, picked up in Victoria Park on some canoe rubble by an unknown man, and they put the story together and they figured he just came by way of canoe, but in fact he'd been tumbled by the wind. He'd been swimming and he'd been hurt a bit, but he got up and the wind wasn't going that strong at that point. He was tumbled ahead, he was scared, he ran, he fell exhausted in Victoria Park, he was near canoe, and people just put this together. You know, the reporters were looking for a great story and said, oh my God, this kid came all the way by a canoe from Wascana Lake, you know. See, this is how
and
the
another
stories-
crazy story was about a baby that was found in an oven in the street, you see, and they figured the baby had been, and the oven had been blown out of the house, but there's no way the mother was baking that baby. So what happened was that the baby crawled into the oven from the street outside.
Perhaps one of the craziest stories is that of Frank and Bertha Blankhorn. They were married in England in April of 1912, and they're going to take their honeymoon cruise on the Titanic. But they missed the boat because I guess they were partying too hard or something like that. And they found another boat, and they later arrived in Regina, and they were there in the afternoon of June 30th. As Frank and Bertha walked across Victoria Park, the full fury of the cyclone hit. They were picked up and tumbled across 200 yards into LORNE Street. Their lifeless bodies were found between Methodist Parsonage and the now roofless Carnegie Library.
But there was one very, very
The
sad
baby
tale.
was safe, by the way.
Yeah, very
She was-
sad tale.
Okay.
That concerns Frank and Bertha Blankhorn. They were English, and they had booked passage on the Titanic to come to Canada, and they had a big party and all this sort of thing.
Same
Guess
year.
They got into the
Right,
Screech, maybe,
in
Harry, or
April.
something, you see. So anyway, they missed the Titanic, which means they didn't go down with the Titanic. They were lucky. They made it to Canada. But they were outside walking along, and they got caught in the fury of the storm. They both got smashed into the brick wall of the library and were killed.
2.5
That's very
months
sad.
after the
It's
Titanic
very
disaster.
sad.
Yeah,
Isn't it?
they
Very
thought
sad
their
indeed,
lives
eh?
were charmed.
But the city was,
Yeah.
you know, the papers said the city's in total darkness, telephone systems destroyed, street, railway, and every other public utility ruined, business of every kind of to stand.
The Bilby family at 2354 Smith Street took refuge in their attic. The cyclone neatly tore it off. It took the attic off of the house and carried it with all the inhabitants over 150 feet and neatly deposited the entire attic in a neighbor's yard. None of the Bilbys were hurt. They climbed out a window and they were fine. 4 blocks further north at 1947 Smith Street, the home of the Hodson family, they were not so lucky. When the front wall of the house collapsed, 3 roomers and one of the Hodson children were killed. Arthur Donaldson was one of those roomers. He had been out walking his dog, a small brown mongrel, just like you, Kenny, a small brown mongrel. He rushed toward the house as the storm roared up and was killed as it was reduced to rubble. The dog was blown past. After calm returned, the dog came back to the ruined house. The dog watched as the rescuers dug through the wreckage, then followed when the victim of his master was taken to Spear's funeral parlor. From Sunday to Wednesday, when his master was finally buried, the dog kept vigil. After that, he disappeared. I don't know if he disappeared, but no one knows what happened to him. The Reverend Dr. James Falconer, visiting from Pine Hill College, Halifax, had preached in Knox Church that very morning. He was sitting on an upstairs veranda, and he suddenly called his hostess. I thought the Methodist Church was over there. Now I can't see it. Absolutely demolished it was, and the parsonage to it. The telephone exchange building at the corner of Lowman 11th Avenue was virtually destroyed. The roof was blown off and the south wall collapsed. Then the weight of the switchboard broke through the floor on the second story, carrying 3 women and 1 man all the way down to the basement. None of them were seriously injured. They managed to climb out and go through a window. When they appeared at the offices of the Regina Leader to tell the story of their narrow escape, no one believed them. The reporters thought they wanted to see their names in print and were just making stories up.
But of course, there were lucky people. There were 3 girls in the telephone switchboard, which weighed 15 tons. And when the building collapsed or exploded, they and the switchboard, they didn't complete many calls during that time, went down into the basement. Zoom, boom, down into the basement. They got out somehow and went over to the Regina Leader, the paper, and said, we've just been through a horrible, horrible experience. There's been a tornado or something. And that they wouldn't believe them at the paper because the paper was just outside the area. And
They
there were
didn't know
five
it had
other,
happened.
Yeah,
Isn't
five
that
other
incredible?
girls in
Really
the building
is.
who got out, you see.
They were trapped,
because
but they were
the
okay.
edge of it is like that. There's a tornado
knife.
here, and there just isn't one there.
Yeah.
So there's fantastic stories, you know, really fantastic.
One funny little note, a fella called Mr. Potts, who was a plumber, his house was just in ruins, and the next morning he was found sitting in front of it on a piano stool, which I think was about the only piece of furniture that was left, and he was reading a book. And he told people quite cheerily that this book had blown into his yard. You know what it was called? Business Hints for Beginners.
After destroying hundreds of houses as it rolled up Lorne Street, the cyclone destroyed Knox Presbyterian and Metropolitan Methodist churches and tore the cupola off the Baptist church. Then the Regina Public Library, which had only opened 1 month earlier, had its roof taken right off. The Mercantile and Warehouse District from South Railway Street north to Dewdney received the full brunt of the storm. C.L. Delarue described the destruction. Not only was one elevator laying across the tracks, but 4 more besides in the railway yards. There was not a single car on the tracks. A great brick warehouse on the other side of the tracks was missing. C.R. Delarue was staying at the Clayton Hotel. At the approach of the storm, he rushed to the top floor of the building to close the windows, where he observed heaps of girls in hysterics. The fellows were white as ghosts. How he got down to the next floor, he says, I don't know, but I did, and I found my way to the piano. For all I was worth, I played, and I drowned my fears. Once the storm had passed, Delarue went into the street to chronicle the damage. Pretty well every glass plate window in the city was broken, and the rain had just played Old Harry with the merchandise. The magnificent churches of the morning were in ruins. Knox Presbyterian Church looks just like an old English ruin. The YMCA and YWCA buildings were only recently opened, were terribly dilapidated. Lorne Street was strewn with all kinds of goods, telegraph poles, trees, lumber, glass, and parts of furniture and clothing. On a walk the previous day, Delarue had admired the houses on Lorne. He said, one might almost call them mansions. Now there were 70 or 80 as flat as a pancake. There wasn't a post standing. It was impossible to recognize the houses that had stood there. Finally, he noted that people were running this way and that way screaming. Other people were dragging the injured out. Soon every available vehicle was pressed into service, and they made for the hospitals with the injured. Alerted by telegraph from Winnipeg, all the functioning lines from Regina led east. The first relief from outside was a train from Moose Jaw that arrived at the exhibition grounds at about 7:15 p.m., loaded with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. A train from Winnipeg arrived early the next morning. One of the first groups to respond to the need for assistance was a visiting American theatrical troupe, the Albini Avalo Company, who were performing at the Regina Theatre. The troupe included a then unknown Boris Karloff. The afternoon of the storm, they had been out on a picnic out along Wisconsin Creek and were unaware of what happened until they returned that evening. They staged a benefit performance of the comedy The Real Thing in Regina. The following week, they donated half the proceeds from their performances in Saskatoon to the relief effort. Dominion Day the next day was cancelled. The city was in ruins, and a long, lengthy effort to clean up and dig the survivors out from the rubble was underway. If you find videos like this helpful, interesting, worth your time, then please do me a favor, hit like, hit subscribe, hit share, join the channel, join my Patreon, support me, and maybe I'll just keep doing it some more. Here is the people who've been supporting me so far. Thank you. I would just like the world to know how thankful I am to my patrons and supporters.
Thank you, everybody!
And the Global Mail in Toronto, with typical Toronto snottiness, wrote an editorial in which it said, while there are no grounds for regarding the cyclone as a constant possibility, it would be well for the whole prairie country to modify all air current as far as possible by the planting of trees. So there you are. It's Toronto. And the next day, on July 2nd, the Dominion Trust Company, talk about greed and all that sort of. And Dominion Trust Company in Regina, in the Leader, took a whole half page saying, tornado insurance 50 cents per $100 for 3 years.
Would they make it retroactive?